The gunshot that shattered the wedding ceremony wasn't meant for the bride, but Natalie Dawson ran anyway, her white silk gown trailing behind her like a ghost as she fled into the dusty streets of Seattle, Washington on that scorching afternoon in July 1882. She didn't stop to think about where she was going or what she was leaving behind, only that the man waiting for her at that altar was someone she couldn't marry, not after discovering what he truly was beneath that charming smile. Her lungs burned as she pushed through the crowded marketplace, ignoring the startled faces of townspeople who watched a bride running like her life depended on it, because perhaps it did. Seattle was growing fast in those days, transforming from a rough lumber town into something approaching civilization, though the wilderness still pressed close on all sides. Natalie had lived there her entire 21 years, daughter of Marcus Dawson, who owned the largest sawmill in the territory, and she'd been groomed since girlhood to make an advantageous match. Gerald Whitmore had seemed perfect on paper, a successful businessman from San Francisco with investments in shipping and timber, handsome, and educated with impeccable manners. Her father had been thrilled with the arrangement. Natalie had been cautiously optimistic, willing to do her duty and hoping affection might grow with time. Then, 3 days before the wedding, she'd overheard Gerald talking with his associate in her father's study. The words still echoed in her mind as she ran. He'd spoken about her like she was livestock, discussing how controlling her father's business through marriage would give him dominance over Seattle's lumber trade. Worse, he'd laughed about how easy it would be to manage a naive girl who'd never questioned anything in her sheltered life. The coldness in his voice when he mentioned that accidents happen to inconvenient wives had frozen her blood. She'd kept quiet, playing the dutiful bride while her mind raced through possibilities. Running seemed impossible until the moment the gunshot rang out during the ceremony. Someone in the crowd had a grudge against one of the guests, and in the chaos that followed, Natalie saw her chance. She grabbed her skirts and bolted, leaving her bouquet scattered on the church steps. Now she found herself at the edge of town, her elegant wedding shoes torn and bloody, her carefully arranged hair falling in disarray around her shoulders. The road stretched before her, leading into dense forest that climbed toward the Cascade Mountains. Behind her, she could hear shouting. Gerald would be looking for her. Her father would be furious. She had no money, no supplies, nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate need to get away. Natalie plunged into the forest, branches catching at her dress and veil. The white fabric was like a beacon, so she tore the veil off and kept moving, trying to put distance between herself and anyone who might follow. The afternoon sun filtered through the towering evergreens, and she realized with growing panic that she had no idea where she was going. She'd never been outside Seattle proper without an escort. The wilderness that surrounded the town had always been something she viewed from a safe distance. Hours passed. The light began to fade. Natalie's feet were bleeding inside her ruined shoes, and exhaustion dragged at every step. She'd been moving uphill for what felt like forever, and now she could hear water rushing somewhere nearby. A stream maybe, or a river. She pushed toward the sound, thinking at least she wouldn't die of thirst. When she finally broke through the underbrush, she found herself on a rocky bank overlooking a fast-moving creek. The water looked cold and clear, and she dropped to her knees beside it, cupping her hands to drink. The liquid was shockingly cold, straight from mountain snowmelt, and it cleared some of the fog from her exhausted mind. She splashed water on her face, washing away the careful makeup that had been applied that morning for her wedding day. The irony wasn't lost on her. This morning she'd been a pampered daughter of privilege, preparing for a ceremony that would secure her future. Now she was alone in the wilderness, her future terrifyingly uncertain, but at least it was her own. Dark was falling fast. Natalie knew she needed shelter, but had no idea how to build one or even what to look for. The temperature was dropping too, and her thin silk dress provided almost no warmth. She was shivering when she heard the sound of a horse moving through the forest. Panic seized her. Had Gerald found her already? She scrambled up, looking for somewhere to hide, but her white dress glowed in the dimness. The horse and rider emerged from the trees about 30 yards upstream, and Natalie froze like a rabbit, hoping the predator might not see her if she stayed still. The rider spotted her immediately. He reined in his horse, a big bay gelding that snorted and stamped. The man himself was tall and lean, wearing worn denim and a dark jacket, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the distance. Then he nudged his horse forward, moving slowly, and Natalie found herself backing up until her heels hit the creek bank, and there was nowhere left to go. The rider stopped about 10 feet away and dismounted in one fluid motion. When he pushed his hat back, she could see his face in the fading light. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair and a strong jaw shadowed with several days of beard. His eyes were light, blue or gray, and they studied her with an expression that wasn't threatening but wasn't exactly friendly either. "You're a long way from town, miss," he said. His voice was deep and quiet, with an accent that suggested he'd grown up somewhere south of Washington Territory. Natalie opened her mouth to respond, but found that all the fear and exhaustion and stress of the day was suddenly too much. To her absolute horror, she felt tears burning in her eyes. She tried to blink them back, but they spilled over anyway, tracking down her dirty cheeks. "I ran away," she heard herself say, the words tumbling out between sobs that shook her whole body. "And now I'm lost." The admission felt like failure, like proof that Gerald had been right about her being a naive girl who couldn't take care of herself. But it was the truth, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise. The cowboy was quiet for a moment, then he stepped closer, and Natalie could see his expression had softened. "Then you're found right now," he said simply. Something about the certainty in his voice made Natalie's knees weaken. She sat down hard on a fallen log, her ruined dress pooling around her, and put her face in her hands. She could hear him moving, the creak of leather as he pulled something from his saddlebags. Then there was warmth settling over her shoulders, and she realized he'd draped his jacket around her. It smelled like wood smoke and pine and horse, and it was the most comforting thing she'd ever felt. "Name's Bennett Mallory," the cowboy said. "I've got a camp about a mile from here. Not much, but it's got a fire and food, and it's a damn sight better than spending the night out here in a wedding dress." Natalie looked up at him, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "How did you know it was a wedding dress?" He gave her a look that suggested the question didn't really need answering. She was covered in white silk, and there was still orange blossom woven into what remained of her hairstyle. "Right," she said quietly. "I'm Natalie Dawson." Something flickered in Bennett's eyes at the name. Recognition, maybe. The Dawson name carried weight in Seattle, but all he said was, "Can you walk, or do you need to ride?" Natalie tried to stand and gasped as pain shot through her feet. Bennett was beside her in an instant, his hand under her elbow steadying her. Up close, she could see he was even younger than she'd first thought. Maybe not much older than her own 21 years, but there was a weathered quality to him that spoke of a hard life lived outdoors. "Riding it is," he said. He guided her toward his horse, then lifted her into the saddle like she weighed nothing. Natalie grabbed the saddle horn, suddenly aware of how high up she was, and how she'd never actually ridden a horse without a side saddle and proper supervision. Bennett swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins, and she found herself pressed against his chest as he turned the horse back into the forest. They rode in silence, the horse picking its way carefully through the darkening woods. Natalie could feel Bennett's steady breathing behind her, the warmth of his body cutting through the evening chill. She wanted to explain, to tell him why she'd run, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a riptide, and it was taking all her concentration just to stay upright in the saddle. True to his word, they reached his camp within a mile. It was a small clearing with a canvas tent set up beneath the trees and a fire pit ringed with stones. The remains of a fire still glowed with embers. Bennett dismounted and lifted Natalie down, then guided her to sit on a log near the fire while he tended to his horse. She watched him work, moving with practiced efficiency as he unsaddled the bay and hobbled it so it could graze. He built up the fire until it was throwing real heat, then dug through his supplies and came back with a canteen and what looked like dried meat. "It's not fancy," he said, handing her both, "but it'll keep you going." The water was stale and warm, the meat tough and salty, and Natalie thought she'd never tasted anything better. She ate slowly while Bennett sat on the other side of the fire, giving her space but keeping watch. Now that there was light, she could see him more clearly. He had the build of someone who worked hard for a living, all lean muscle and calloused hands. There was a revolver on his hip and a rifle propped against a tree within easy reach. Not threatening, just practical. This was wild country still, even this close to Seattle. "You want to tell me what happened?" Bennett asked after a while. His voice was gentle, not pushing, but the question hung in the air between them. Natalie wrapped his jacket tighter around her shoulders. "I was supposed to get married today, to a man named Gerald Whitmore. He's from San Francisco, came up here to invest in timber." She paused, staring into the fire. "I thought I was doing the right thing. My father arranged it, and Gerald seemed like a good match, successful, respectable. But he wasn't," Bennett said. "It wasn't a question. No." Natalie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I overheard him talking 3 days ago. He's only marrying me to get control of my father's business. And he said things about how wives can have accidents, about how easy it would be to manage me." She looked up, meeting Bennett's eyes across the fire. "I got scared. And when someone fired a gun during the ceremony today, everyone panicked and I just ran. I didn't have a plan, I just knew I couldn't marry him." Bennett's jaw tightened, and there was something dangerous in his expression for just a moment before it smoothed out. "You did the right thing," he said firmly. "Takes courage to run when everyone's telling you to stay." "Courage or stupidity," Natalie said bitterly. "I have no money, no skills, nowhere to go. My father will be furious. Gerald will be looking for me. I've ruined everything, and for what? To die of exposure in the woods." "You're not going to die of exposure," Bennett said. "And you didn't ruin anything except a bad man's plans. That's not something to regret." His certainty was like a lifeline, and Natalie found herself clinging to it. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, wanting to shift the conversation away from her own disaster. Bennett poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks drifting up into the dark. "I work timber cruising. Scout out sections of forest, estimate board feet, report back to the lumber companies about which areas are worth cutting. Been doing it for about 3 years now, ever since I came up from Colorado." "Why did you leave Colorado?" "Same reason you ran today, I suppose." "Bad situation that needed leaving." He didn't elaborate, and Natalie didn't push. They all had their secrets. "Will you take me back to Seattle?" she asked, though the thought of returning filled her with dread. Bennett was quiet for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" "No," Natalie admitted. but I don't know what else to do." "You could not go back," Bennett said. "There's a whole territory out here. Lots of places a person could start over, with no money and no skills." Natalie shook her head. "I can embroider and plan dinner parties. I can speak French and play the piano." "None of that's very useful in the wilderness." "You'd be surprised what's useful. Can you cook?" "I've never had to. Can you sew?" "I can do needlepoint. Close enough. Can you shoot?" "Absolutely not." Bennett actually smiled at that, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and less guarded. "Well, we'll work on it. Point is, you can learn if you want to." Natalie stared at him. "Are you saying you'd help me?" "I'm saying you have options." "Running back to Seattle and begging your father's forgiveness, that's one option. Probably not a good one, given what you've told me about this Gerald fellow, but there are others." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's a settlement about 2 days' ride from here, up in the mountains. Place called Cedar Ridge. It's small, mostly miners and loggers, but there's families there too. They could use a teacher if you can read and write. Or there's other work, cooking and cleaning for the boarding house, that kind of thing. It's not fancy, but it's honest, and it's far enough from Seattle that your father and his business partner probably wouldn't think to look there." Hope flickered in Natalie's chest, dangerous and bright. "Why would you help me? You don't know anything about me." Bennett shrugged. "I know you had the guts to run when it mattered. I know you're sitting here eating trail rations in a torn wedding dress instead of crying for someone to fix your problems. That tells me enough." He stood up, stretching. "You should get some sleep. We can figure out the details in the morning." "Where will I sleep?" Natalie looked at the small tent dubiously. "You take the tent. I'll sleep out here by the fire. I've done it plenty of times before." He pulled a blanket from his supplies and tossed it to her. "It's not much, but it's better than silk for keeping warm." Natalie caught the blanket, rough wool that smelled of horse and wood smoke, and felt tears prick her eyes again. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know why you're being kind to me, but thank you." Bennett looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Get some rest, Miss Dawson. Things'll look better in the morning." Natalie crawled into the tent and wrapped herself in the blanket. She could hear Bennett moving around outside, feeding the fire and settling down. She thought she'd be too keyed up to sleep, her mind racing with everything that had happened, but exhaustion dragged her under almost immediately. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon frying. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't figure out where she was, then it all came flooding back. The wedding, the running, Bennett finding her by the creek. She sat up, wincing at the pain in her feet and the stiffness in her muscles. Every part of her ached, morning light filtered through the canvas, bright and clear. Natalie crawled out of the tent and found Bennett crouched by the fire, tending a small skillet. He looked up when she emerged, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Morning. There's coffee in the pot if you want it, and I've got some bacon and biscuits going." Natalie's stomach growled audibly. She hadn't eaten a proper meal since lunch the day before, too nervous about the wedding to manage more than a few bites at dinner. She poured herself coffee into a battered tin cup and sat down on the log, sipping carefully. It was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot and it cleared the fog from her brain. Bennett handed her a tin plate with bacon and hard biscuits. They ate in companionable silence while the forest woke up around them. Birds called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker hammered at bark. It was peaceful in a way Natalie had never experienced. Even in Seattle's fanciest parlors, there had always been an undercurrent of tension, the constant performance of being a proper young lady. "So," Bennett said eventually, setting his empty plate aside. "What do you want to do?" Natalie took a deep breath. "Tell me more about Cedar Ridge. Is it really possible I could make a life there?" "It's possible. Won't be easy and it won't be comfortable like you're used to, but it's possible." Bennett poured himself more coffee. The settlement's grown up around a silver mine. Not a big operation, but it's steady work. There's maybe 40, 50 people living there permanent, more in the summer when the prospectors come through. They've got a general store, a boarding house, a saloon. No real school yet, but I know the families have been wanting one. If you could teach the kids their letters and numbers, they'd pay you for it. Not much, but enough to live on. And you think they'd accept me? A runaway bride from Seattle, Bennett met her eyes steadily. I think they'd accept someone willing to work hard and not put on airs. What you were before, that doesn't matter much in a place like Cedar Ridge. It's what you do there that counts. Natalie thought about her options. She could go back to Seattle and face her father's wrath, Gerald's manipulation, the scandal and gossip. Even if she refused to marry Gerald, she'd be ruined in Seattle society. No respectable man would want her after this, and her father would probably lock her away somewhere to avoid the embarrassment. Or she could go forward into unknown territory, to a rough mining settlement where she knew no one and had no guarantee of success. It was terrifying. It was also the first real choice she'd ever had in her life. I want to go to Cedar Ridge, she said. If you'll take me there. Something that might have been approval flickered in Bennett's eyes. I'll take you. But we need to do something about that dress first. You'll never make it 2 days in the mountains wearing that. Natalie looked down at her ruined wedding gown, torn and stained and completely impractical. I don't suppose you have a spare set of clothes in your saddlebags, not in your size. But I've got needle and thread, and there's enough fabric in that dress to make something more practical. You said you could sew, right? Needlepoint and embroidery. I've never made a garment from scratch. Well, you're about to learn. Bennett dug through his supplies and came up with a small sewing kit. Simplest thing is to make a split skirt and a shirt from what you've got. I can show you the basic pattern, but you'll have to do the actual sewing. They spent the morning working on it, Bennett sketching out pattern pieces in the dirt with a stick while Natalie carefully unpicked seams and cut fabric. The silk was beautiful but impractical, so she worked with the cotton underskirts and chemise, creating a rough approximation of a riding outfit. Her stitches were clumsy compared to her usual needlework, but they held. Bennett contributed his spare shirt, which was far too large but could be belted at the waist. By noon, she had something resembling practical clothes. She changed in the tent while Bennett saddled his horse, and when she emerged, she felt strange and free. The split skirt was scandalous by Seattle standards, showing her ankles and allowing her to move without restriction. The shirt hung loose over it, and she tied her hair back with a strip of silk from her wedding dress. She looked nothing like the refined young lady who'd fled the church yesterday. Bennett studied her for a moment, then nodded. It'll do. Can't do much about the shoes, though. Those are ruined. Natalie's feet were wrapped in strips of fabric torn from her petticoat, the best they could manage. Every step hurt, but she gritted her teeth and limped toward the horse. The ride toward Cedar Ridge was nothing like Natalie's previous experiences on horseback. Bennett set a steady pace, following trails that were barely visible to her untrained eyes. They climbed higher into the mountains, the air growing thinner and cooler. Natalie rode in front again, Bennett's arms around her as he guided the horse, and she tried not to think about how improper this all was. Propriety seemed like a luxury from another lifetime. They stopped to rest and water the horse at a small stream around midday. Natalie slid down from the saddle and immediately sat down, her abused feet unable to support her weight any longer. Bennett knelt beside her and carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandages. "These are infected," he said grimly, examining the cuts and blisters. "We need to clean them properly." He had her soak her feet in the cold stream water while he dug through his supplies for whiskey. Natalie knew what was coming and braced herself, but the burn of alcohol on open wounds still made her gasp and bite back a cry. Bennett worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning each cut and blister before wrapping her feet in clean cloth. "I'm sorry," Natalie said through clenched teeth. "I'm slowing you down." "You're doing fine," Bennett said. "Better than fine, considering you ran through the forest in dancing shoes yesterday." He sat back on his heels, studying her. "Most society women I've met would still be crying about their ruined dress." "I did cry about it," Natalie pointed out. "Last night when you found me." "That was shock and fear, not vanity. There's a difference." Bennett stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, we'll make camp early tonight, give you some time to rest." They rode for another few hours before Bennett found a suitable spot, a small clearing with good water and shelter from the wind. Natalie tried to help set up camp, but found herself mostly getting in the way, her lack of experience painfully obvious. Bennett didn't comment, just worked around her and showed her simple tasks she could manage. By the time the fire was going and dinner was cooking, Natalie felt slightly less useless. "Tell me about timber cruising," she said as they ate. "What's it like, wandering through the forests alone?" Bennett was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Peaceful mostly. I like the solitude. No one expecting anything from me, no one disappointed when I don't live up to their expectations. Just me and the trees and the work. That sounds lonely. Sometimes, but lonely's better than trapped." He glanced at her. "You understand that, I think." Natalie did. She'd been surrounded by people her entire life in Seattle, but she'd never felt lonelier than when sitting in rooms full of her father's friends and business associates, smiling and nodding and playing the part of the perfect daughter. "My mother died when I was 12, she said quietly. "After that, it was just my father and me, and he threw himself into his work. I had tutors and chaperones and a whole household of servants, but no one actually wanted to know me. They wanted the version of me that was convenient." "That's why you were going to marry Gerald Whitmore," Bennett said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, my father wanted the business connection and I wanted to please him. I wanted to matter to someone." Natalie laughed bitterly. "Instead, I discovered that Gerald saw me as a useful object, just like everyone else." "You matter," Bennett said suddenly, fiercely. "Not because of who your father is or what you can do for someone's business. You matter because you're you, and the fact that no one taught you that is a damn shame." Natalie felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you're brave and you're trying hard and you don't complain even when your feet are torn to pieces. That's not nothing, Natalie." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about the way he said it made her breath catch. She looked across the fire at him, this cowboy who'd appeared out of nowhere and offered help without asking for anything in return, and felt something shift in her chest. Gratitude, yes, but also something else, something warmer and more dangerous. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell around them. Bennett taught her how to identify different bird calls and pointed out constellations in the clear mountain sky. Natalie found herself relaxing in a way she couldn't remember doing before, the constant tension she'd carried in Seattle falling away with each hour that passed. "Can I ask you something?" Natalie said eventually. "You said you left Colorado because of a bad situation. What happened?" Bennett's expression closed off slightly. "Family trouble. My father had plans for me, same as yours did for you. Wanted me to take over his ranch, marry a girl from a neighboring property, settle down and produce heirs. It was all arranged, all decided without asking what I wanted." "What did you want?" "Freedom, choice. A life that was mine instead of his version of what my life should be." Bennett poked at the fire with a stick. "So I left, headed north and kept going until I found work that suited me. Haven't been back since." "Do you miss it?" Your family. My mother sometimes. My sisters. But my father. Bennett shook his head. He made it clear when I left that I was dead to him. Can't miss someone who decided you don't exist. Natalie thought about her own father, probably frantic with worry or furious at the scandal or both. She wondered if he'd be able to forgive her, or if she'd burned that bridge completely. The thought hurt less than she expected. Maybe Bennett was right. Maybe lonely was better than trapped. The next day they rode higher into the mountains. The forest changed as they climbed, the massive cedars and firs giving way to smaller pine and spruce. Wildflowers dotted the meadows they passed through, brilliant purple and yellow against the green. Natalie had never seen country like this, wild and untouched and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Bennett was patient with her questions, teaching her to identify plants and animal tracks, explaining how to read the landscape. She was a quick study, soaking up information like she was starving for it. In Seattle, she'd been educated in French literature and piano sonatas, but none of it had felt as vital as learning which berries were safe to eat and how to find north without a compass. They stopped for lunch beside a high mountain lake, the water so clear Natalie could see straight to the bottom. While Bennett tended to the horse, she sat on a flat rock and watched fish dart through the shallows. It was so peaceful here, so far removed from the world she'd known. She could almost imagine staying here forever, never going back to civilization at all. "Penny for your thoughts," Bennett said, settling down beside her with their lunch. "I was thinking this might be the most beautiful place I've ever seen. It's something, isn't it? I come up this way every few months for work, and it never gets old." He handed her a piece of jerky and some dried fruit. "We'll reach Cedar Ridge by tonight if we keep a good pace." Natalie felt a flutter of nerves. What if they don't want me there? What if I can't do the work? "Then we'll figure something else out, but I think you're going to surprise yourself." Bennett looked at her, and there was warmth in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "You're stronger than you think, Natalie Dawson." They reached Cedar Ridge as the sun was setting, painting the mountain peaks gold and crimson. The settlement was rough and raw, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around the mine entrance. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Natalie could hear the sound of voices and laughter from what was probably the saloon. Bennett led his horse down the main street, which was really just a wide path beaten into the dirt. People stopped what they were doing to stare at the newcomers. Natalie felt their eyes on her and fought the urge to shrink back. She sat up straighter instead, trying to project a confidence she didn't quite feel. Bennett stopped in front of a 2-story building with a sign that read, "Cedar Ridge Boarding House and Meals." A woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. She was in her 40s, sturdily built with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and shrewd eyes that took in every detail of Natalie and Bennett. "Bennett Mallory," the woman said. "Didn't expect to see you up here for another month. Hello, Mrs. Patterson. I've brought someone who might be able to help with that teacher problem you've been having." Bennett dismounted and helped Natalie down. "This is Natalie Dawson. She's looking for work and a fresh start." Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed as she studied Natalie, taking in the makeshift clothes and bandaged feet, the educated bearing that no amount of trail dust could completely hide. "Dawson. That's a Seattle name if I've ever heard one. You running from something, girl?" Natalie met her gaze steadily. "Yes, madam, I am, but I'm willing to work hard and earn my keep. Mr. Mallory mentioned you might need someone to teach the children. Can you read and write?" "Yes, madam, and do arithmetic. I speak French and know some Latin. I can teach geography and history and literature." Mrs. Patterson snorted. "Fancy education. We don't need Latin up here, but reading and writing and numbers, that's valuable." Lord knows these mining families want better for their children than breaking their backs underground. She crossed her arms. What are you really running from? A husband? A man who was going to be my husband, Natalie said carefully. A man who turned out to be someone I couldn't marry, so I left. Smart girl. Men who show their true colors before the wedding are doing you a favor, even if it doesn't feel like it. Mrs. Patterson jerked her head toward the door. Come inside. You look half dead on your feet. Bennett, you'll stay for supper. I've got stew on. Appreciate it, madam. The boarding house was simple but clean, with a common room that served as dining area and gathering place. Mrs. Patterson showed Natalie to a small room upstairs, barely big enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it had a door that closed and a window that looked out on the mountains. Room and board is $3 a week if you're working, Mrs. Patterson said. Teaching pays about $5 a week, so you'll have a bit left over for necessities. Classes would be in the morning, 6 days a week. Afternoons you help me here in the boarding house, cooking and cleaning. That sound acceptable? More than acceptable, Natalie said, relief flooding through her. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Don't thank me yet, we'll see how you do. But the older woman's expression was softer now. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up. Supper's in 20 minutes. After Mrs. Patterson left, Natalie sat down on the bed and let herself process everything that had happened. 3 days ago, she'd been preparing for her wedding in a comfortable bedroom in her father's house. Now she was sitting in a tiny room in a mining settlement, about to start a completely new life. It should have been terrifying. Instead, she felt something close to excitement. She washed her face and hands, tidied her hair as best she could, and went back downstairs. Bennett was sitting at one of the long tables in the common room, talking with a couple of rough-looking men who were probably miners. He looked up when Natalie appeared, and something in his expression made her warm all over. Supper was simple but filling, hearty beef stew with fresh bread. Mrs. Patterson introduced Natalie to the handful of boarders who lived there, a mix of miners and loggers who were polite enough but clearly curious about the educated young woman who'd appeared out of nowhere. Natalie answered their questions carefully, giving away as little as possible about her past. After the meal, Bennett walked with her out onto the porch. The night was cool and clear, stars brilliant overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. You did good in there, Bennett said. Mrs. Patterson's tough but fair. If she's given you the job, it means she sees potential. I couldn't have done it without you, Natalie said quietly. Any of it. You saved my life, Bennett. He shook his head. You saved your own life. I just gave you a ride. It was more than that, and you know it. Natalie turned to face him fully. Will you stay in Cedar Ridge for a few days? I've got work to do in the area, timber to survey, but then I'll have to move on. He paused. Unless you need me to stay longer. Part of Natalie wanted to ask him to stay, to keep this connection that had formed between them over the past 2 days. But she knew that wasn't fair. Bennett had his own life, his own work. She couldn't ask him to give that up for her. I'll be fine, she said, trying to sound confident. You've already done more than enough. Bennett looked like he wanted to say something else, but he just nodded. I'll be around for a bit. If you need anything, you let me know. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Natalie met the families in Cedar Ridge who had children of school age, about a dozen kids ranging from 6 to 14. They were a rough crew, unused to formal education, but they were eager to learn. Natalie set up a classroom in an unused storage room behind the general store, with borrowed benches and a slate board Bennett helped her install. Teaching was harder than she'd expected, but also more rewarding. The children tested her constantly, pushing boundaries, but when she stood firm and showed she genuinely cared about their learning, they began to settle down. She tailored her lessons to their lives, using mining calculations to teach arithmetic and local geography to make the world real to them. In the afternoons, she worked at the boarding house, learning practical skills she'd never needed before. Mrs. Patterson taught her to cook in bulk, to do laundry by hand, to manage supplies and budgets. It was exhausting work, but Natalie fell into bed each night with a sense of accomplishment she'd never felt in Seattle. Bennett was around most days, working out of Cedar Ridge while he surveyed the surrounding forests. He'd stop by the boarding house for meals, and often in the evenings he and Natalie would sit on the porch and talk. She found herself looking forward to those conversations, the way Bennett listened to her stories about the children and shared his observations about the forest. There was an ease between them that grew deeper with each passing day. A week after they arrived in Cedar Ridge, Natalie was teaching arithmetic when the door to her makeshift classroom opened and a stranger walked in. He was well dressed by mountain standards, with clean clothes and polished boots, and he carried himself with authority. The children fell silent, staring. "Can I help you?" Natalie asked, her heart suddenly pounding. Something about this man set off warning bells. "Are you Natalie Dawson?" His voice was smooth, educated. Seattle money. Natalie's mouth went dry. "Who's asking?" "My name is Thomas Wright. I'm a private investigator hired by your father and Gerald Whitmore to locate you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "They've been very worried about you, Miss Dawson." The children were watching with wide eyes, sensing drama. Natalie forced herself to stay calm. "Class is dismissed for today. Please go home and practice your letters like I showed you." The kids scrambled out, probably running to spread the news through the settlement. Natalie faced Thomas Wright with her chin up, trying not to show fear. "My father knows where I am. He does now. I tracked you from Seattle, following reports of a woman in a wedding dress running through the forest. It took some time, but I found the lumber camp where Bennett Mallory works, and the trail led here." Wright stepped closer. "Your father is prepared to forgive your temporary madness, Miss Dawson. Mr. Whitmore is willing to proceed with the marriage. All you need to do is come back with me." "No." The word came out stronger than Natalie felt. "I'm not going back. I have a life here now, work that matters. Tell my father I'm fine, but I'm not coming home." Wright's expression hardened. "I don't think you understand the situation. Your father has considerable influence. He could make life very difficult for this settlement if you don't cooperate, and Mr. Whitmore is quite insistent on seeing his investment through." "His investment?" Anger flared hot in Natalie's chest. "Is that what I am?" "You can tell Gerald Whitmore that I know exactly what he is and what he planned. I'll never marry him." "Then you're a fool. You think you can hide out here in this mining camp teaching brats their letters," Wright sneered. "You're Marcus Dawson's daughter. You belong in society, not living like some frontier washerwoman." "I'm exactly where I belong," Natalie said. "And you can leave now." Wright's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip painfully tight. "You're coming with me, Miss Dawson, whether you want to or not. Your father is paying me well to bring you back, and I intend to collect. Let her go." Bennett's voice came from the doorway, cold and dangerous. He stood there with his hand resting on his revolver, his expression harder than Natalie had ever seen it. Wright released Natalie's wrist and turned to face Bennett. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Mallory. This is family business. Natalie's not leaving unless she wants to, and she just made it clear she doesn't want to." Bennett stepped into the room. "So I suggest you head back to Seattle and tell her father she's fine and to leave her alone." "Or what? You'll shoot me," Wright laughed. "There are laws even out here. You can't just kill a man for doing his job." "Self-defense isn't murder," Bennett said mildly. "Especially when a witness saw you grab a lady against her will. Lots of witnesses in Cedar Ridge. Folks here tend to stick together. As if summoned, several miners appeared in the doorway behind Bennett, drawn by the commotion. They looked at Natalie, then at Wright, then at Bennett, their expressions making it clear whose side they were on. Wright's confidence faltered. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and he knew it. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward the door. "Marcus Dawson doesn't give up easily." "Neither does his daughter," Natalie said. "Tell my father I love him, but I'm not coming back. And tell Gerald Whitmore that if he sends anyone else after me, I'll make sure everyone in Seattle knows exactly what kind of man he is." Wright fled, practically running from the settlement. The miners drifted away, satisfied the trouble was handled. Bennett stayed, watching Natalie carefully. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Natalie realized she was shaking. "I think so. How did you know to come?" "One of your students ran to find me, said there was a strange man bothering their teacher." Bennett crossed the room and gently took her hands in his. "Natalie, Wright's going to go back to Seattle and tell them where you are. Your father might send someone else, or he might come himself. It's not safe for you here anymore." "Then where can I go?" Natalie heard the desperation in her own voice. "I can't keep running forever." "No, but you can make yourself harder to find." Bennett paused, and Natalie could see him working through something in his mind. "There's another option. One that would make it a lot more complicated for your father to drag you back to Seattle." "What option?" Bennett took a deep breath. "You could marry me." Natalie stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What? If you're married, your father can't force you to marry Gerald. And as your husband, I'd have a legal right to tell investigators and anyone else your father sends to leave you alone." Bennett's words came faster now, like he was afraid if he stopped he'd lose his nerve. "It wouldn't have to be a real marriage if you didn't want it to be. We could have separate rooms, live separate lives. But on paper it would protect you." "Bennett, that's crazy. You can't marry me just to protect me from my father." "Why not? I like you, Natalie. I admire you. You're brave and smart, and you're trying so damn hard to build something real here. If I can help make that possible, why shouldn't I?" He was still holding her hands, his grip warm and steady. "I know it's not romantic or what a woman like you probably dreamed of, but it would work." Natalie's mind raced. A marriage of convenience to Bennett Mallory. It was practical, logical even. It would solve her immediate problem. But something about it felt wrong, like she'd be taking advantage of his kindness. "What would you get out of this?" she asked. "Besides the satisfaction of thwarting my father's plans?" Bennett hesitated, and something vulnerable flickered across his face. "Honestly, a reason to stay in one place for a while. I've been drifting for 3 years, moving from job to job, never putting down roots. Part of me's getting tired of that. And the thought of settling here with you, building something together even if it's just a partnership." He shrugged. "That doesn't sound so bad. You'd give up your freedom for me." "I'd be choosing something different, not giving up freedom. There's a difference." Bennett squeezed her hands gently. "But only if you want to. I'm not trying to pressure you, Natalie. If you want to take your chances and stay here as you are, I'll support that too. I just want you to know you have options." Natalie looked at Bennett, really looked at him. In the week and a half since he'd found her by the creek, he'd been nothing but kind and supportive. He'd asked for nothing in return, just helped because it was the right thing to do. She trusted him in a way she'd never trusted Gerald, never even trusted her own father. And if she was being completely honest with herself, her feelings for Bennett had grown beyond simple gratitude. She liked him, enjoyed his company, looked forward to seeing him each day. The thought of him leaving Cedar Ridge, going back to his solitary wandering, made her chest ache. "If we did this," she said slowly, "it would have to be a real marriage, not just on paper. I won't trap you in some half-life arrangement where we're both miserable." Bennett's eyes widened slightly. Natalie, you don't have to do that. I know you didn't run away from one forced marriage just to end up in another one. This wouldn't be forced. It would be my choice. Natalie took a shaky breath. I care about you, Bennett. I don't know if it's love yet, but it could be. And if we're going to do this, we should do it right. Build something real together, not just a legal fiction. For a long moment, Bennett just stared at her, and Natalie worried she'd misread everything, that he'd only offered out of pity or obligation. Then he smiled, slow and genuine, and it was like the sun coming out. Then I guess we'd better find someone to marry us, he said. Mrs. Patterson, when told of their plans, was skeptical at first, but after a long conversation with both Bennett and Natalie separately, she gave her grudging approval. You're both old enough to know your own minds, she said. And Bennett's a good man. You could do a lot worse, girl. The settlement circuit preacher wouldn't be back for another 3 weeks, but one of the miners had been a ship's captain before coming to the mountains, and he was legally able to perform marriages. They held the ceremony the next evening in the common room of the boarding house, with the whole settlement crowded in as witnesses. Natalie wore a simple dress borrowed from Mrs. Patterson, dark blue cotton that fit reasonably well. Bennett had shaved and put on a clean shirt, and he looked almost nervous as they stood together in front of Captain Morrison. The ceremony was brief and practical. None of the elaborate ritual of the wedding Natalie had fled from. When Captain Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Bennett kissed her gently, almost shyly, and Natalie felt her heart flutter. The settlement threw them an impromptu celebration, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible from such a small population. Natalie found herself laughing and dancing, swept up in the genuine warmth of these rough mountain people who'd accepted her as one of their own. Bennett was by her side through it all, attentive but not possessive, making sure she was comfortable but not crowding her. Finally, late in the evening, they retreated to the small room that would now be theirs, Mrs. Patterson having moved Natalie's few belongings into Bennett's slightly larger quarters. Natalie felt suddenly nervous, very aware that they were married now, that this was their wedding night. Bennett seemed to sense her tension. I can sleep on the floor if you want, he offered, or I can go bunk with the miners for tonight, give you space to adjust. No, Natalie said quickly. I mean, this is your room, our room now. I don't want to kick you out. She twisted her hands together, trying to find the right words. I meant what I said about wanting this to be a real marriage, but I'm nervous. I don't really know what I'm doing. Bennett crossed the room and took her hands, stilling their anxious movement. We don't have to do anything tonight except sleep. We have time, Natalie. There's no rush. The kindness in his voice, the patience, made Natalie's eyes sting with tears. I'm so tired of being afraid, she whispered. Afraid of making the wrong choice, of disappointing people, of being hurt. With you, I don't feel afraid, I feel safe. You are safe, Bennett said fiercely. I will never hurt you, Natalie. That's a promise. She believed him. Rising on her toes, she kissed him, tentative at first and then more confident when he responded. His arms came around her, holding her close but not constraining, and Natalie let herself melt into his warmth. They took their time learning each other, gentle and careful, and when they finally fell asleep tangled together in the narrow bed, Natalie felt more at peace than she ever had in her life. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm. Natalie taught her students in the mornings, worked at the boarding house in the afternoons, and spent her evenings with Bennett. He'd taken a permanent position surveying timber for the mining company, which meant he was based out of Cedar Ridge with occasional trips into the surrounding forests. They were building a life together, bit by bit. Word reached them about a month after the wedding that Thomas Wright had returned to Seattle and reported Natalie's marriage to her father. Marcus Dawson's response had been explosive, according to the rumors that filtered up to the mountains. He'd threatened legal action, but his lawyers had informed him that Natalie was of age and had married of her own free will. There was nothing he could do. Gerald Whitmore had moved on to another business opportunity, another bride in San Francisco. Apparently Natalie's defection had stung his pride but not his heart, since he'd never had feelings for her to begin with. The gossip in Seattle had been vicious for a few weeks, then faded as new scandals emerged. Natalie found she didn't care what they thought of her anymore. Her feet healed. Her hands developed calluses from work. She learned to cook and clean and do 100 practical things she'd never needed to know in Seattle. More than that, she learned to make decisions for herself, to trust her own judgment, to build something with her own hands and mind. And she fell in love with her husband. It happened gradually, in small moments. The way Bennett brought her wildflowers he'd found while surveying. The patience he showed teaching her to shoot, standing behind her with his arms around her, guiding her aim. The quiet conversations by lamplight where they shared dreams and fears and secrets. The way he looked at her like she was precious, like she mattered for who she was and not what she represented. One evening in late August, about 2 months after their wedding, they were sitting on the porch of the boarding house watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Bennett had his arm around Natalie's shoulders, and she was leaning into his warmth. "I love you," she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could second-guess them. "I don't know when it happened exactly, but it's true. I love you, Bennett Mallory." She felt him go still, then he turned her to face him. His eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough. "Have for weeks now, maybe since that first night when you were so damn brave even though you were terrified. You're extraordinary, Natalie." He kissed her then, deep and tender, and Natalie felt something settle in her chest. This was what love was supposed to feel like. Not the cold arrangement with Gerald, not the dutiful affection she tried to manufacture. This was real and warm and right. Summer faded into autumn, and the aspens on the mountainsides turned gold. Natalie's school grew as more families moved to Cedar Ridge, drawn by the steady work at the mine. Bennett built them a small cabin on the edge of the settlement, just 2 rooms but all their own. Natalie helped where she could, learning to think logs and mix mortar, and when they moved in on a crisp October evening, she felt like a queen in a castle. They furnished it slowly, piece by piece. Bennett made a bed frame and table, sturdy and practical. Natalie sewed curtains from fabric ordered through the general store. They acquired a wood stove for cooking and heat, a few chairs, shelves for Natalie's growing collection of books. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, built together. Winter came to the mountains with a vengeance, snow piling high and temperatures dropping below zero. The mine slowed operations but didn't stop, and neither did Natalie's school. She taught the children in the mornings, then hurried home to the warmth of their cabin where Bennett would have a fire going and something cooking for lunch. They were snowed in for most of December and January, the settlement cut off from the outside world. It should have felt isolating, but Natalie loved it. She and Bennett spent long evenings reading aloud to each other, playing cards, talking about everything and nothing. They made love by firelight and fell asleep wrapped in quilts in each other's arms. Natalie had never been happier. Spring came late to the high country, but when it arrived it was glorious. The snow melted, revealing wildflowers that carpeted the meadows. Natalie's students were restless with spring fever, but she was patient with them, remembering how it felt to be young and desperate for sunshine after a long winter. In April, Natalie realized she'd missed her monthly courses. Then May came and went with no sign of them. By June she was certain, though she waited until she was sure before telling Bennett. He'd come home from surveying one evening, tired and dusty, and found Natalie sitting on the steps of their cabin looking nervous and excited at the same time. "Everything okay?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Everything's wonderful," Natalie said. "Bennett, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." She watched emotions cascade across his face, shock, then joy, then something that looked like fear. He sat down heavily beside her on the steps. "A baby," he repeated like he was testing the words. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "We're going to be parents. Are you happy about it?" Natalie asked, suddenly anxious. They'd never really discussed children, had been too focused on building their life together. Bennett pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified, yes. I don't know the first thing about being a father, but happy, Natalie. So damn happy." They told Mrs. Patterson the next day, and word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. The whole settlement seemed invested in Natalie's pregnancy, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and predictions about whether it would be a boy or a girl. Natalie was touched by the outpouring of support from these people who'd become her family. The pregnancy was hard in some ways. Morning sickness kept her miserable for the first few months, and by late summer, the heat made her uncomfortable and swollen. But Bennett was attentive and patient, taking over more of the household work and making sure she rested. Dr. Morrison, who ran a small practice in the settlement, checked on her regularly and pronounced her healthy. The baby came in late January, in the middle of a snowstorm. Labor started in the evening and lasted through the night, Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Morrison attending while Bennett paced anxiously in the other room. When the baby finally arrived with the dawn, a healthy boy with a strong set of lungs, Natalie was exhausted but triumphant. Bennett held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect," he whispered. "Natalie, he's perfect." They named him Thomas after Bennett's grandfather, with the middle name Marcus for Natalie's father. It was an olive branch of sorts, an acknowledgement of where they'd come from even as they built something new. Being parents was harder than either of them had anticipated. Thomas was colicky and didn't sleep well, and for the first few months, Natalie and Bennett stumbled through exhaustion and uncertainty. But they figured it out together, learning as they went, and gradually Thomas settled into a routine. Natalie had to take a break from teaching for a few months, but by the time Thomas was 6 months old, she was back in the classroom with him in a basket beside her desk. The children loved having a baby in the schoolroom, and the older girls competed to help care for him during breaks. Life continued its rhythm. Bennett's work with the timber company expanded, and he was offered a partnership in a small lumber mill being built near Cedar Ridge. It was an opportunity to put down even deeper roots, and he accepted. Natalie's school grew into a proper establishment, with funding from the mining company and a real building instead of the storage room. When Thomas was 2, Natalie became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was easier. Their daughter, Sarah, was born in September 1886, a calm baby who seemed to take everything in stride. Thomas was fascinated by his little sister, and Bennett was equally besotted with both his children. 3 years after running away from her wedding, Natalie stood on the porch of her cabin watching Bennett play with Thomas and Sarah in the yard. The little cabin had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, with a second bedroom and a proper kitchen. The lumber mill was thriving, and Natalie's school now had 3 teachers including herself, serving nearly 50 students. It was a life she could never have imagined when she fled Seattle in her wedding dress. A life built on hard work and love and the courage to choose her own path. She thought sometimes about her father, wondered if he ever regretted driving her away. She'd written to him once after Thomas was born, letting him know he had a grandson. He'd never responded, and that hurt, but it didn't devastate her the way it might have once. She had her own family now, built with Bennett. Mrs. Patterson came up the path, huffing slightly with the climb. She was older now, with more silver in her hair, but still running the boarding house with an iron fist. "Mail came," she said, handing Natalie an envelope. "Looks like it's from Seattle." Natalie's heart skipped. The envelope was expensive paper, her name written in an elegant hand she didn't recognize. She opened it carefully and pulled out a letter. It was from her father's lawyer, informing her that Marcus Dawson had died of a heart attack 2 weeks prior. He'd left her everything, the house and the business, with a personal note saying he'd been proud of her strength even if he'd been too stubborn to say so while he was alive. He asked her forgiveness and said he hoped she'd found the happiness she deserved. Natalie sank down onto the porch steps, tears streaming down her face. Bennett saw her distress and came running, children trailing behind him. "What happened?" he asked, taking the letter from her shaking hands. He read it quickly, then sat down beside her and pulled her into his arms. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know it's complicated, but I'm sorry." "He forgave me," Natalie sobbed into Bennett's shoulder. "He was proud of me." "Of course he was," Bennett said fiercely. "How could he not be?" The inheritance presented difficult questions. The Seattle business would need managing, decisions would need to be made. Natalie and Bennett talked long into the night, weighing their options. In the end, they decided to sell the business and the house. The money would secure their children's futures and allow them to expand both the lumber mill and the school. Natalie would never move back to Seattle, never return to that life. But she could take the good parts of what her father had built and use them to strengthen what she and Bennett had created. They made one trip to Seattle to handle the legal matters, bringing Thomas and Sarah with them. Natalie walked through her childhood home one last time, surprised by how small it seemed now, how suffocating. The parlor where she'd entertained guests felt stuffy and formal compared to the warm chaos of her mountain cabin. She took a few precious items, photographs of her mother and some books, but left the rest to be sold with the house. Gerald Whitmore was long gone, moved to Los Angeles with a wife he'd acquired somewhere along the way. Natalie heard through gossip that he'd been caught in some shady business dealings and had left San Francisco under a cloud. She felt nothing but pity for whoever had ended up married to him. They stayed in Seattle for a week, just long enough to finalize everything, and Natalie was profoundly relieved when they boarded the stage heading back to the mountains. Thomas and Sarah were cranky from travel, and Bennett looked as uncomfortable in his Sunday suit as Natalie felt in her visiting dress. "Ready to go home?" Bennett asked as the stage rolled out of Seattle. "More than ready," Natalie said, leaning against his shoulder. "Take me home, husband." The years passed gently after that. The lumber mill prospered, providing good jobs for the growing settlement. Natalie's school became one of the best in the territory, drawing families to Cedar Ridge who wanted their children educated. They added a third child, another son named James, born in 1889 when Natalie was 28. Bennett never went back to timber cruising alone. He'd found his place in Cedar Ridge as a businessman and father and husband. Sometimes on quiet evenings, he'd tell the children stories about his wandering days, but he never seemed to miss that life. He'd found something better. Natalie taught until Thomas was old enough to take over the school. Then she transitioned to writing textbooks specifically designed for frontier children, using examples and context they could relate to. Her books were published and distributed throughout the Western territories, and she corresponded with educators from Oregon to Montana. On a warm summer evening in 1895, Natalie and Bennett sat on the porch of their expanded home watching the sunset. Their children were grown now, or nearly so. Thomas at 14 was already showing Bennett's aptitude for business and was learning to run the mill. Sarah at 12 was a natural teacher, patient and kind with the younger children at school. James at 6 was pure mischief, always getting into trouble but impossible not to love. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Natalie asked, lacing her fingers through Bennett's. "If I hadn't run from that wedding, if you hadn't found me by the creek." Bennett was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes, but I try not to dwell on it. What happened, happened. We made the choices we made, and look what we built from it." "I ran away and I was lost," Natalie said softly, remembering that desperate girl in the torn wedding dress, terrified and alone in the forest. "And then you were found," Bennett finished, pulling her closer. "We found each other, Natalie. Everything else just followed from that." She rested her head on his shoulder, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. Somewhere inside the house, she could hear James laughing at something Sarah said, Thomas playing a tune on the piano they'd bought last year. These were the sounds of home, of family, of a life built on love and choice and courage. Natalie thought about the girl she'd been, sheltered and uncertain, desperate to please others even at the cost of her own happiness. That girl seemed like a stranger now. The woman she'd become was strong and capable, a teacher and mother and wife, someone who'd built something real with her own hands. "Thank you," she said to Bennett, the words encompassing everything. "Thank you for finding her, for believing in her, for building this life with her." "Thank you for running," Bennett replied, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you for being brave enough to choose your own path, even when it was terrifying. You saved yourself, Natalie. I just got to come along for the ride." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Inside the house, their children called for them, wanting dinner, wanting attention, wanting all the ordinary things that made up a life. Natalie and Bennett stood, hand in hand, and went inside to their family. The story could have ended there with that perfect moment of contentment. But life continued its steady march forward, bringing new challenges and joys. In the fall of 1895, Cedar Ridge faced a crisis when the main shaft of the silver mine collapsed, trapping 12 miners underground. The entire settlement mobilized for the rescue effort, Bennett leading teams to shore up the unstable tunnel while Dr. Morrison set up a field hospital. Natalie organized food and supplies, coordinating the women who kept coffee and meals flowing to the exhausted rescue workers. For 3 days they worked around the clock, digging through tons of rock and timber. Bennett barely slept, his face drawn and haggard as he pushed himself past exhaustion. When they finally broke through and brought out the miners, all alive though some seriously injured, the settlement erupted in celebration. That night, as Natalie bandaged Bennett's torn and bloody hands, he broke down. "I kept thinking about those men's families," he said hoarsely. "About their kids growing up without fathers, about what you and our children would do if it was me trapped down there." "But it wasn't," Natalie said firmly, holding his face in her hands. "You're here, you're safe. Those men are safe because of you." The mine disaster prompted changes. Bennett led the effort to improve safety standards, working with the mining company to implement better support systems and emergency protocols. It was time-consuming work on top of running the lumber mill, but Bennett threw himself into it with characteristic determination. Natalie supported him however she could, proud of the man he'd become, the leader the community turned to in times of crisis. Thomas turned 15 in 1896 and announced his intention to go to Portland for further education. Natalie's heart clenched at the thought of her firstborn leaving, but she and Bennett had always encouraged their children to pursue their dreams. They arranged for Thomas to stay with a respectable family in Portland while attending a technical school focused on business and engineering. Saying goodbye to Thomas was one of the hardest things Natalie had ever done. She held him tight, this young man who'd been her baby such a short time ago, and made him promise to write every week. Bennett shook his son's hand solemnly, then pulled him into a fierce hug. "You make us proud, son," Bennett said, his voice thick. "You always have." With Thomas gone, the house felt emptier. Sarah stepped up to help more with James, and Natalie threw herself into her writing work. She'd been commissioned to write a comprehensive history of education in the Washington Territory, a project that would take years, but fascinated her. Bennett sensed her melancholy and made an effort to create special moments together. He'd take her on rides up into the mountains like they'd done in the early days of their marriage, packing a picnic and spending the afternoon exploring. They'd reconnect in those quiet hours away from responsibilities, remembering why they'd fallen in love in the first place. Sarah showed increasing interest in medicine, spending hours with Dr. Morrison learning about herbs and treatments. When she was 14, she asked if she could apprentice formally with the doctor. Natalie and Bennett agreed, though Natalie worried about her daughter seeing some of the harsh realities of frontier medicine. But Sarah had her father's steady temperament and her mother's determination. She didn't flinch at blood or injury, and she had a gift for comforting frightened patients. Dr. Morrison said she was the best assistant he'd ever had, and encouraged her to consider training as a nurse or even a doctor in a few years. James, meanwhile, was proving to be the adventurous one. At 8 years old, he was always off exploring, coming home with torn clothes and tales of adventure. He reminded Natalie of what she imagined Bennett must have been like as a boy, curious and fearless, and a little wild. They had to keep close watch on him to make sure his adventures didn't cross the line into genuine danger. In the spring of 1898, Thomas returned from Portland for the summer, bringing with him a young woman named Elizabeth Carter. She was a banker's daughter from Portland, educated and refined, and Natalie saw in her glimpses of the girl she herself had once been. Thomas was clearly smitten, and Elizabeth seemed genuinely charmed by Cedar Ridge despite its rough edges. "She wants to see where I come from," Thomas explained to his parents, "to understand this place that shaped me." Elizabeth proved adaptable, rolling up her sleeves to help in the garden and not complaining about the primitive conditions compared to Portland. Natalie liked her, appreciated her genuine interest in learning about their lives. When Thomas announced at the end of summer that he and Elizabeth were engaged, Natalie cried happy tears. The wedding took place the following spring in Cedar Ridge, a celebration that brought together the mountain community and Elizabeth's family from Portland. It was nothing like the elaborate wedding Natalie had fled from 17 years earlier. This was simple and heartfelt, held outdoors with wildflowers decorating the makeshift altar, and the love between Thomas and Elizabeth was evident to everyone. As Natalie watched her son marry his chosen bride, Bennett squeezed her hand. "Thinking about our wedding," he murmured. "Thinking about how lucky we both are," Natalie replied. "Thomas found someone he truly loves. We found each other. Not everyone gets that." Thomas and Elizabeth settled in Portland where Thomas had good job prospects, but they visited Cedar Ridge regularly. Natalie made her peace with her son building his life away from the mountains, grateful that at least he'd found happiness. Sarah, now 17, had indeed decided to pursue nursing. She would be leaving for training in Seattle in the fall of 1900. Another child flying the nest, but Natalie was immensely proud of her daughter's ambition and skill. That left James, now 11, and showing signs of wanting to follow his father into the timber business. He spent every spare moment at the mill, watching Bennett work and asking endless questions. Bennett was patient with him, teaching him the business from the ground up. One evening in late summer of 1900, Natalie was working on her manuscript when Bennett came in from the mill, his expression troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. Bennett sat down heavily. "Big company from California has been buying up timber rights in the region. They approached me about selling the mill, offered a substantial amount of money." Natalie set down her pen. "Do you want to sell?" "Part of me does. We could retire comfortably, travel, spend more time with the grandchildren when Thomas and Elizabeth start having kids." Bennett ran a hand through his hair, now streaked with gray. "But this mill is my life's work, and it's James's legacy if he wants it. I don't know what to do." They talked late into the night, weighing options and outcomes. In the end, Bennett decided not to sell. The mill would stay in the family, a legacy for James and whatever children he might have someday. Money was important, but some things mattered more. The new century brought changes to Cedar Ridge. The silver mine was playing out, the rich veins of ore running thin. Some families moved away to find work elsewhere, and the population that had swelled to nearly 200 began to decline. But the lumber mill kept operating, and Natalie's school remained strong, adapting to serve fewer students but maintaining its high standards. In 1902, Thomas and Elizabeth welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Natalie. When Bennett and Natalie traveled to Portland to meet their granddaughter, Natalie held the tiny baby and marveled at the circle of life. This child carried her name and her son's features, and would grow up in a world of opportunity that Natalie herself had helped create by refusing to accept limitations. Sarah completed her nursing training and accepted a position at a hospital in Seattle. She came home whenever she could, always bringing medical supplies for Dr. Morrison and stories about her work. She loved nursing, the challenge and the satisfaction of healing, and Natalie could see her daughter thriving. James, at 15, was officially apprenticing at the mill and showing real aptitude for the work. He had Bennett's eye for timber quality and Natalie's head for numbers, a combination that promised well for the future of the business. On a quiet evening in 1903, Natalie and Bennett celebrated their 21st wedding anniversary. They'd come a long way from that hasty ceremony in Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, but the foundation had always been solid. Love and respect and partnership, built on the courage of a woman who'd run away and a man who'd helped her find herself. They walked up to the meadow above their house, the same place Bennett used to take Natalie in the early days of their marriage. The wildflowers were in full bloom, and the mountains stretched endlessly in every direction. 21 years, Natalie said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together. Best decision I ever made, Bennett said, pulling her close. Marrying you. Best decision I ever made was running away, Natalie replied. If I'd stayed, if I'd been too afraid to leave, I would have ended up married to Gerald and miserable, or worse. You saved yourself that day, Bennett reminded her. You were so brave, Natalie, still are. She thought about that girl in the wedding dress, terrified and lost in the forest. She'd felt weak then, like a failure for not being able to handle her problems. But Bennett was right. It had taken tremendous courage to run, to choose uncertainty over a known danger. And everything good in her life had flowed from that one brave choice. We should get back, Bennett said as the sun began to set. James will be wondering where we are. They walked down the mountain hand in hand, toward their home where lamplight glowed warm in the windows. James would be inside doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table, the dog asleep at his feet. Tomorrow would bring the familiar rhythm of work and family, challenges and joys. But tonight was perfect, a moment of peace and gratitude for the life they'd built together. Years continued to pass. Thomas and Elizabeth had 2 more children, sons they named Bennett and Marcus, honoring both sides of the family. Sarah met a doctor at the hospital where she worked and married him in 1905, a match that pleased everyone. James took over more responsibility at the mill as Bennett began to slow down, ready to hand the reins to the next generation. Natalie published her history of frontier education to critical acclaim, but more importantly, it became required reading and teacher training programs across the western states. Her work ensured that frontier children would continue to receive quality education, tailored to their unique needs and circumstances. Mrs. Patterson passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1907, at the age of 75. The entire settlement mourned her, this tough woman who'd given so many people a chance when they needed it most. At the funeral, Natalie spoke about how Mrs. Patterson had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, given her work and dignity and a fresh start. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Cedar Ridge continued to shrink as the mine finally closed in 1908, but it didn't die. The lumber mill kept it alive, and families who'd put down roots didn't want to leave. It became a quieter place, more tightly knit, and in some ways Natalie preferred it. The rough edges had been smoothed by time, but the independent spirit remained. In 1910, as Natalie approached her 50th birthday, she looked back on her life with satisfaction. She'd raised 3 successful children who were making their own marks on the world. She'd built a school that had educated hundreds of students over nearly 3 decades. She'd written books that would outlast her. And she'd loved and been loved by a good man, building a partnership that had weathered every storm. Bennett, now 54, had silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting in mountain sunlight. But to Natalie, he was still the cowboy who'd found her by the creek, who'd offered help without asking for anything in return, who'd promised she was found and had kept that promise every day since. They celebrated Natalie's birthday with their children and grandchildren gathered in Cedar Ridge. Thomas and Elizabeth came with their 3 kids. Sarah and her husband made the trip from Seattle. James, now 21 and engaged to a local girl named Martha, helped organize the celebration. The house was full of laughter and chaos and love, exactly as it should be. That night, after everyone had gone to bed or headed back to their own homes, Natalie and Bennett sat on their porch in the quiet darkness. 50 years old, Natalie said. How did that happen? You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, Bennett said simply. Natalie laughed. You're biased. Damn right I am. I get to be biased about my wife. He reached for her hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of decades of practice. Have I told you lately that I love you? Only about 100 times today, but I never get tired of hearing it. Good. Because I plan to keep saying it for the next 50 years. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the mountain. An owl hooted somewhere in the forest. The creek that ran past their property burbled peacefully. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonely song. Do you have any regrets? Bennett asked quietly. About the life we built here. Natalie thought about it seriously, wanting to give him an honest answer. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver earlier, if I'd refused to agree to the engagement with Gerald in the first place. Maybe my father and I could have worked things out before it got to the point where I felt I had to run. But if you'd done that, you might not have ended up here. We might never have met. Exactly. So no real regrets. Everything happened the way it needed to happen for us to find each other. She squeezed his hand. What about you? Do you regret leaving Colorado, giving up your wandering life? Not for a second. I thought I wanted freedom, but what I really wanted was to belong somewhere, to matter to someone. You gave me that, Natalie. You and our family. I've never felt trapped here. I've felt home. The words settled around them like a benediction. Home. They'd built it together from nothing. Two people who'd been lost in different ways finding their way to each other and creating something solid and real and lasting. More years passed, bringing the gradual shifts that time always brings. Bennett eventually fully retired from the mill, handing it over to James and his new wife Martha. He spent his days poring over newspapers, maintaining their property, and spoiling his growing brood of grandchildren. Natalie continued writing, though she took on fewer projects, preferring to spend time with family. The school that Natalie had founded continued under new leadership, teachers she'd trained carrying on her methods. She served on the school board, providing guidance and wisdom earned through 3 decades of frontier education. Her legacy was secure in that building, in those students who'd learned their letters and numbers and so much more under her patient instruction. In 1915, the world was changing in ways that seemed both exciting and frightening. War raged in Europe, though America had stayed out of it so far. Technology was advancing rapidly, with automobiles and telephones becoming more common even in remote places like Cedar Ridge. The frontier was closing, the wild spaces Natalie and Bennett had known slowly being tamed and civilized. Thomas wrote about the changes in Portland, the growth and modernization. Sarah's letters from Seattle described a bustling city barely recognizable as the lumber town where Natalie had grown up. The world was racing forward, and sometimes Natalie felt like she and Bennett were relics of an earlier, simpler time. But then she'd look at their legacy, the children and grandchildren spreading across the Pacific Northwest, making their own marks on this changing world, and she'd feel proud rather than obsolete. They'd been part of building this region, taming the wilderness while respecting its power, creating communities that would outlast them. On a summer evening in 1916, Bennett and Natalie sat on their porch watching the sunset as they'd done thousands of times before. They were older now, moving more slowly, but still fundamentally themselves. Bennett at 60 still had that quiet strength that had first attracted Natalie. She at 56 still had the determination and curiosity that had helped her survive that desperate flight through the forest. "Do you remember that first night?" Natalie asked suddenly. "When you found me by the creek?" "Every detail," Bennett said. "You were wearing a torn wedding dress and looked like you'd been through hell, but there was something in your eyes, a spark that told me you weren't going to give up." "I felt like giving up," Natalie admitted. "I was so scared and so lost. When you said then you're found right now, I almost didn't believe you. It seemed impossible that anything good could come from running away like that. But it did. We did. We did," Natalie agreed softly. She rested her head on Bennett's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him mixed with pine and wood smoke. "Thank you for finding me, Bennett Mallory. Thank you for seeing who I could be and helping me become her." "Thank you for running," Bennett replied, kissing her hair. "Thank you for being brave enough to save yourself, because otherwise I never would have gotten to love you." They sat together as the stars came out one by one, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built a life that mattered. The mountains stood eternal around them, witness to their love story, silent guardians of the home they'd made. Inside the house, a lamp glowed warm in the kitchen window where James and Martha were visiting for dinner, their 2 young children already asleep in the guest room. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more joys. But tonight was perfect, this moment of peace and love and gratitude for a life well lived together. The years had been kind overall, bringing far more joy than sorrow. They'd built something real and lasting, not just a family but a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Children educated, lives touched, a community strengthened, love given and received in abundance. That girl in the wedding dress running through the forest had been looking for escape, for safety. She'd found so much more. She'd found herself, her strength, her purpose. And she'd found a love that transformed everything, that made all the struggles worthwhile. Bennett squeezed Natalie's hand, and she returned the pressure. A silent conversation 34 years in the making. They didn't need words anymore to communicate love and contentment, and that bone-deep satisfaction of a life well lived with the right person. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed that desperate flight, that first meeting, every milestone and mundane moment in between. Witnesses to a love story that had started with fear and desperation, and grown into something beautiful and strong and enduring. Natalie thought about the letter her father had sent all those years ago, saying he was proud of her strength. She hoped he'd been able to see, from wherever he was now, just how right he'd been. She'd taken the courage it took to run that day and built on it, creating a life of purpose and meaning and love. "Ready for bed?" Bennett asked eventually, the chill of evening settling in. "Ready," Natalie said, standing and stretching. Tomorrow they'd wake up together as they had for over 3 decades, facing another day of life's ordinary magic. For now, they had this perfect moment, this pause before sleep, this reminder of how lucky they'd been to find each other. They went inside together, hand in hand, to their home full of memories and love. Behind them, the mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping watch over the settlement they'd helped build, the family they'd created, the love story that had begun with tears and terror, and transformed into something precious beyond measure. The cowboy and the runaway bride, found in the wilderness and making their way together ever since. It was a good story, a true story, and it was theirs.